突然ですが皆さん、英語を話せるようになりたいですか？英語はたくさん勉強するより、たくさん訓練することが重要です。ただ、いきなり長いセリフをランダムに聞きまくってもあまり意味がないので、的を絞った超簡単なところから始めて、徐々に理解できる幅を増やしていくワークをやっていきましょう。このワークで、リスニング力とスピーキングの瞬発力を養ってほしいから、こんな感じで、2ステップに分けた訓練をしていきますね。今回のワークは前回の過去形だよ。独り言にも使えるから、ぜひ最後まで頑張ってみてね。もしこのワークが気に入ってくれたら、チャンネル登録と通知をポチッとお願いします。じゃあ、ワークをやっていきましょうか。
Were you happy? Were you happy?
I was happy. I was happy.
Were you tired? Were you tired?
I was tired. I was tired.
Were you hungry? Were you hungry?
I was hungry. I was hungry.
Were you full? Were you full?
I was full. I was full.
Were you thirsty? Were you thirsty?
I was thirsty. I was thirsty.
Were you sleepy? Were you sleepy?
I was sleepy. I was sleepy.
Were you cold? Were you cold?
I was cold. I was cold.
Were you hot? Were you hot?
I was hot. I was hot.
Were you excited? Were you excited?
I was excited. I was excited.
Were you sad? Were you sad?
I was sad. I was sad.
Were you bored? Were you bored?
I was bored. I was bored.
Were you nervous? Were you nervous?
I was nervous. I was nervous.
Were you confused? Were you confused?
I was confused. I was confused.
Were you busy? Were you busy?
I was busy. I was busy.
Were you free? Were you free?
I was free. I was free.
Were you calm? Were you calm?
I was calm. I was calm.
Were you fine? Were you fine?
I was fine. I was fine.
Were you ready? Were you ready?
I was ready. I was ready.
Were you here? Were you here?
I was here. I was here.
Were you there? Were you there?
I was there. I was there.
Were you late? Were you late?
I was late. I was late.
Were you sick? Were you sick?
I was sick. I was sick.
Were you well? Were you well?
I was well. I was well.
Were you good? Were you good?
I was good. I was good.
Were you lonely? Were you lonely?
I was lonely. I was lonely.
Were you lost? Were you lost?
I was lost. I was lost.
Were you home? Were you home?
I was home. I was home.
Weren't you happy? Weren't you happy?
I wasn't happy. I wasn't happy.
Weren't you tired? Weren't you tired?
I wasn't tired. I wasn't tired.
Weren't you hungry? Weren't you hungry?
I wasn't hungry. I wasn't hungry.
Weren't you thirsty? Weren't you thirsty?
I wasn't thirsty. I wasn't thirsty.
Weren't you sleepy? Weren't you sleepy?
I wasn't sleepy. I wasn't sleepy.
Weren't you cold? Weren't you cold?
I wasn't cold. I wasn't cold.
Weren't you hot? Weren't you hot?
I wasn't hot. I wasn't hot.
Weren't you excited? Weren't you excited?
I wasn't excited. I wasn't excited.
Weren't you sad? Weren't you sad?
I wasn't sad. I wasn't sad.
Weren't you bored? Weren't you bored?
I wasn't bored. I wasn't bored.
Weren't you nervous? Weren't you nervous?
I wasn't nervous. I wasn't nervous.
Weren't you confused? Weren't you confused?
I wasn't confused. I wasn't confused.
Weren't you busy? Weren't you busy?
I wasn't busy. I wasn't busy.
Weren't you free? Weren't you free?
I wasn't free. I wasn't free.
Weren't you calm? Weren't you calm?
I wasn't calm. I wasn't calm.
Weren't you fine? Weren't you fine?
I wasn't fine. I wasn't fine.
Weren't you ready? Weren't you ready?
I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready.
Weren't you here? Weren't you here?
I wasn't here. I wasn't here.
Weren't you there? Weren't you there?
I wasn't there. I wasn't there.
Weren't you late? Weren't you late?
I wasn't late. I wasn't late.
Weren't you sick? Weren't you sick?
I wasn't sick. I wasn't sick.
Weren't you well? Weren't you well?
I wasn't well. I wasn't well.
Weren't you good? Weren't you good?
I wasn't good. I wasn't good.
Weren't you lonely? Weren't you lonely?
I wasn't lonely. I wasn't lonely.
Weren't you lost? Weren't you lost?
I wasn't lost. I wasn't lost.
Weren't you home? Weren't you home?
I wasn't home. I wasn't home.
では次に、ここまでの英語を瞬時に作れるかの確認ワークをしていきましょう。
幸せでしたか？ Were you happy? 幸せじゃなかったですか？ Weren't you happy? 疲れてましたか？ Were you tired? 疲れてなかったですか？ Weren't you tired? お腹は空いてましたか？ Were you hungry? お腹が空いてなかったですか？ Weren't you hungry? 満腹でしたか？ Were you full? 喉は渇いてましたか？ Were you thirsty? 喉が渇いてなかったですか？ Weren't you thirsty? 眠かったですか？ Were you sleepy? 眠くなかったですか？ Weren't you sleepy? 寒かったですか？ Were you cold? 寒くなかったですか？ Weren't you cold? 暑かったですか？ Were you hot? 暑くなかったですか？ Weren't you hot? ワクワクしてましたか？ Were you excited? ワクワクしなかったですか？ Weren't you excited? 悲しかったですか？ Were you sad? 悲しくなかったですか？ Weren't you sad? 退屈してましたか？ Were you bored? 退屈ではなかったですか？ Weren't you bored? 緊張してましたか？ Were you nervous? 緊張しなかったですか？ Weren't you nervous? 混乱してましたか？ Were you confused? 混乱してなかったですか？ Weren't you confused? 忙しかったですか？ Were you busy? 忙しくなかったですか？ Weren't you busy? 暇でしたか？ Were you free? 暇ではなかったですか？ Weren't you free? 落ち着いてましたか？ Were you calm? 落ち着いてなかったですか？ Weren't you calm? 大丈夫でしたか？ Were you fine? 大丈夫ではなかったですか？ Weren't you fine? 準備はできてましたか？ Were you ready? 準備ができてなかったですか？ Weren't you ready? ここにいましたか？ Were you here? ここにいなかったですか？ Weren't you here? そこにいましたか？ Were you there? そこにいなかったですか？ Weren't you there? 遅れましたか？ Were you late? 遅くなかったですか？ Weren't you late? 具合が悪かったですか？ Were you sick? 気分が悪くなかったですか？ Weren't you sick? 元気でしたか？ Were you well? 元気ではなかったですか？ Weren't you well? よかったですか？ Were you good? よくなかったですか？ Weren't you good? 寂しかったですか？ Were you lonely? 寂しくなかったですか？ Weren't you lonely? 道に迷っていましたか？ Were you lost? 道に迷ってなかったですか？ Weren't you lost? 家にいましたか？ Were you home? 家にいなかったですか？ Weren't you home?
嬉しかったです。
I was happy.
幸せじゃなかったです。
I wasn't happy.
疲れてました。
I was tired.
疲れてなかったです。
I wasn't tired.
満腹でした。
I was full.
お腹が空いてました。
I was hungry.
お腹が空いてなかったです。
I wasn't hungry.
喉が渇いてました。
I was thirsty.
喉が渇いてなかったです。
I wasn't thirsty.
眠かったです。
I was sleepy.
眠くなかったです。
I wasn't sleepy.
寒かったです。
I was cold.
寒くなかったです。
I wasn't cold.
暑かったです。
I was hot.
暑くなかったです。
I wasn't hot.
ワクワクしてました。
I was excited.
ワクワクしませんでした。
I wasn't excited.
悲しかったです。
I was sad.
悲しくなかったです。
I wasn't sad.
退屈してました。
I was bored.
退屈ではなかったです。
I wasn't bored.
緊張してました。
I was nervous.
緊張しなかったです。
I wasn't nervous.
混乱してました。
I was confused.
混乱してなかったです。
I wasn't confused.
忙しかったです。
I was busy.
忙しくなかったです。
I wasn't busy.
暇でした。
I was free.
暇ではなかったです。
I wasn't free.
冷静でした。
I was calm.
穏やかではなかったです。
I wasn't calm.
元気でした。
I was fine.
大丈夫ではなかったです。
I wasn't fine.
準備はできてました。
I was ready.
準備ができてませんでした。
I wasn't ready.
ここにいました。
I was here.
ここにいませんでした。
I wasn't here.
そこにいました。
I was there.
そこにいませんでした。
I wasn't there.
遅れました。
I was late.
遅れなかったです。
I wasn't late.
病気でした。
I was sick.
気分は悪くなかったです。
I wasn't sick.
元気でした。
I was well.
元気ではありませんでした。
I wasn't well.
良かったです。
I was good.
良くなかったです。
I wasn't good.
一人ぼっちでした。
I was lonely.
一人ぼっちではなかったです。
I wasn't lonely.
道に迷っていました。
I was lost.
道に迷っていませんでした。
I wasn't lost.
家にいました。
I was home.
家にいませんでした。
I wasn't home.
今回のワークはここまでです。ちょっとずつですが、できることの幅を徐々に広げていきましょう。まったね。